All rise. The High Court of the Sovereign Theocracy of Georgia Lina is now in session.
Be seated. Charles Robert Darwin?
Yes, Your Honor.
You are charged posthumously with crimes against the sovereign theocracy of Georgia Lina, to include blasphemy, atavism, moral depravity, aggression, eugenics, and fabrication. How do you plead?
Not guilty, Your Honor.
Mr. Prosecutor.
Yes, Your Honor.
Is the sovereign theocracy of Georgia Lina prepared to present the charges?
Yes, Your Honor, the prosecution is prepared.
The jury has been properly impaneled. Proceed.
On the charge of blasphemy, the theocracy accuses the defendant of reckless disregard for the inspired word of God as given to us in the book of Genesis, chapter 1, specifying that all species were created in their present forms. Mr. Darwin, in your book on the origin of species, do you or do you not claim that all species are descended from a few or one common ancestor?
Yes, sir, I do.
Mr. Darwin, don't you think that flies in the inspired word of God?
I have no desire to offend those who would accept the book of Genesis as a true description of beginnings. But in my book, on the origin of species, I am simply interpreting the observations that I've made over many years and many miles. And since I am being tried posthumously, I might also claim the rather considerable evidence for my theory that has been accumulated by many scientists since my passing. But alas, I can't claim that none of my successors have no ill will toward those who would accept a literal interpretation of the book of Genesis.
Then you admit to blasphemy.
I profess no ill will toward the book of Genesis or toward those who might adhere to the descriptions of its origins of life.
You bring up your successors who support your theory of the origin of species by variation and natural selection. Do you then confess to being the leadership of a group of infidels and blasphemers who have ignored the evidence of creation science which supports the intelligent design of life, and you favor a contrived data supporting your theory which has become known as the theory of evolution?
I can claim no leadership. I can claim only what I myself have observed and how I have interpreted those observations. Whether or not scientists from succeeding generations have been influenced by my observations and interpretations is a decision that they have to make. But I must say that I am pleased by the scientists of the future have treated me so well.
Then you admit to having conspired with the future against the evidence presented by creation science.
I admit only that my hypothesis was based on evidence that I gathered in my lifetime. Apparently, my hypothesis has turned into a theory, as attempts to prove it false have failed. As the evidence supporting my theory mounted, it became accepted as a fact by the scientific community. I am pleased by that development, and I can only hope that my theory will be eventually accepted by the general population.
Then you admit that you wish to convince the public that your theory is correct, and that the account of creation of plants and animals, as explained in Genesis, is factually inaccurate.
Well, yes, but I'm assuming that the writers of Genesis did not have access to the information that I have access to.
Then you admit to contesting the Word of God as is written in Genesis.
Well, I suppose I am contesting that the book of Genesis is the Word of God.
That's enough on blasphemy. Or on the charge of atavism.
On the charge of atavism, the theocracy accuses the defendant of lowering the status of man to a beast of the wild. Mr. Darwin, do you or do you not admit in your book, The Descent of Man, you have claimed that the human species is descended from monkeys?
Well, not exactly.
And what does that conjecture lead to the conclusion that the noble human should act like the lowly monkey?
To answer the first question, I should say that my future colleagues have shown that humans have not descended directly from the current great apes, but from a common ancestor living 5 million years ago. No, 5 million years is a long time, and a considerable differentiation in phenotype in both species can occur in that amount of time. Fortunately, considerable changes in behavior can also occur in 5 million years.
Phenotype? What do you mean by phenotype?
Phenotype refers to the physical appearance of the organism. Is it a monkey or is it human? Unfortunately, genes and genotype were not known in my lifetime, but the difference in physical characteristics of species was known. However, those differences did not have a name until the underlying mechanism for their cause was discovered. While genotype refers to the specific genetic differences between organisms, phenotype refers to the differences in appearance or function that the genotype imparts to the organism.
If the monkey and the human had a common ancestor, how do you then explain the savage nature of the lesser primates? Wouldn't the human be inclined toward this savage behavior?
On this subject, let me say 2 things. First, the savage behavior of the great apes is very much exaggerated. And second, the savage behavior of the human in comparison to those apes is very much underestimated. On the first point, we need to look at the future research of Diane Fossey, Jane Goodall, and Delute Galdikas to recognize that the great apes are very social animals and that their family units are not all that different from our own. These researchers have shown that violence by the great apes is employed only in defense of the family or social unit, in competition for territorial resources, or in competition for copulation rights. It is interesting that violence in humans is employed for pretty much the same reasons, and at nearly the same frequency. The difference is that humans have access to considerably more destructive power when they employ violence.
So you are saying that savagery is no less common in the humans than in the monkeys?
Well, yes. Savagery in the humans may be more sophisticated, more organized, and more deadly than in the great apes, but it is still attaining an end by force.
Then you are admitting that your theory lowers the human to the savagery of the ape?
Lowers would not be a word that I would use in this case. It appears that violence is used by humans and the great apes at about the same frequency.
Mr. Prosecutor, are you ready to move on to the charge of moral depravity?
Yes, Your Honor, I am ready for moral depravity.
Carry on.
Mr. Darwin, isn't it true that the human is a superior creature to the lower animals? Isn't the human endowed by his creator with a superior intellect so that he can have dominion over the land and water and the plants and the creatures that govern them with moral commandments of the creator? And doesn't your book, The Descent of Man, with its conclusions that the human has descended from the monkeys, undermine the moral demands of the creator leading human behavior into moral depravity?
You present a number of questions for which I am ill-prepared to answer. On your first question, I would say that the human is different from, not necessarily superior to, the other, not necessarily lower, animals. Indeed, the human evolutionary adaptation's specialty seems to be intelligence. But again, I'm ill-prepared to judge. Maybe the critical development that separates humans from other animals is the opposable thumb or true bipedalism. Whether its inherent intelligence suits the human to govern the land, water, plants, and animals of the world remains to be seen.
So, Mr. Darwin, are you saying that morality is an indirect product of variation and natural selection?
Well, yes and no. First, my theory, like any scientific theory, makes no pretense of telling people how they should act. However, it is quite clear that the human species is innately social, and therefore, my theory predicts that we arrive at that sociality through natural selection. Since successful sociality depends on the existence of rules to govern interactions between individuals, and since we can fairly characterize those rules as morality, my theory predicts that morality should arise given sociality. While morality is not a direct consequence of natural selection, it is an indirect consequence of selection for a successful social species. So although my theory does not prescribe a moral code, it does predict that individuals of a social species like ours will be selected out of the population if they exhibit a tendency towards moral depravity.
So you are saying morality is an indirect part of the variation of natural selection?
Can you suggest another plausible source of morality?
Well, religion, of course.
Religion? With its history of human sacrifice, wars, inquisitions, animal sacrifice, burning, slavery, jihad, and other immoral activities, that does not seem to be a plausible source. Religion's concern with morality, furthermore, seems to be quite recent, and religion still has significant trouble in that incident.
Mr. Darwin, are you telling the court that not only is religion not the source of moral behavior, but that moral behavior is an indirect product of what you call the process of variation and natural selection?
I think you summarized that pretty well.
Your Honor, I believe that statement supports the charge of blasphemy.
That is for the jury to decide. Move on with the charge of aggression.
Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Darwin, do you or do you not agree that monkeys are aggressive towards each other?
Well, if we consult the future research of Fossey, Goodall, and Galdikas, and others, we find that, once again, aggression in primate communities is dependent on context. Like other animals, primates will aggressively seek resources to support their needs for air, water, food, procreation, and socialization. If any of these resources is lacking either to an individual primate or to a primate social group, the individual primate or primate social group leader will act aggressively to attain the necessary resources for himself or for his social group.
So you admit that monkeys are aggressive and that they could not be the ancestors of humans?
Well, I'm admitting that monkeys, like all other mammalian species, including humans, will act aggressively when the circumstances dictate, but not necessarily more frequently than humans. But I object to your insinuation that my hypothesis suggests that humans have descended from monkeys. Once again, I have to tell you, my hypothesis suggests that humans and the current great apes are descended from a common ancestor that lived a long time ago. Indeed, future research indicates that the common ancestor for humans and chimpanzees, our closest living relatives, lived about 5 million years ago. And molecular biology, the development of science in the future, has shown that the genetic material of chimpanzees is 99% identical to ours.
So you are saying that humans and chimpanzees are equivalent creatures?
What I'm saying is that humans and chimpanzees are close phylogenetic relatives, and that they had a common ancestor relatively recently in geologic time.
Mr. Darwin, you keep referring to geologic time frames, ancestors that lived 5 million years ago. Are you challenging the calculations of creation science indicating that the world is about 6,000 years old?
In my time, we were sure that the Earth was older than 6,000 years. We are just not sure exactly how old. Fortunately, future science has shown that the Earth is at least 4 billion years old.
Your Honor, it appears that Mr. Darwin's last statement is clearly blasphemy, considering the Bible shows that the Earth is only 6,000 years old.
That judgment is for the jury.
Yes,
Please continue with your additional counts.
Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Darwin, Isn't it true that your theory of evolution, as your theory has been come to be called, supports the elimination of individuals who have inherited a less than optimum set of characteristics?
I'm not sure I know what you mean by elimination.
Doesn't your theory suggest that the most fit will survive, and that we could save ourselves considerable time and resource if we simply eliminate the individuals that do not make the grade?
I'm still not sure what you mean by eliminate, and I am puzzled by your phrase, do not make the grade.
I was trying to be more delicate, but putting it bluntly, doesn't your theory promote the killing of those individuals that are significantly different from the norm in order to promote the health and proliferation of the dominant human phenotype?
Thank you for your clarification. Fortunately, my theory suggests just the opposite. What you are suggesting would be called artificial selection. My theory suggests that we should not interfere with the process. The process of variance and natural selection will select those individuals best suited to the current environment for an advantage in reproduction and therefore an advantage in genetic proliferation. The process is slow and deliberate, and any interference by us in any given generation will only bias the process and decrease the chances of our species to improve.
Mr. Darwin, are you saying that we should not attempt to promote the survival and proliferation of the human population by eliminating the less fit from our genetic pool?
I am saying that it is unlikely at any given time that we can second-guess Mother Nature. And by eliminating those who are different, we may be eliminating the next major advance in the evolutionary process.
So, Mr. Darwin, you are telling me that your theory does not promote the elimination of genetically disadvantaged in our society.
What my hypothesis proposes is that those individuals of any species, including humans, best adapted to the current environment will produce the most offspring and thus over time will be most represented in the population. My hypothesis does not propose any active involvement in our species by our species in the process. Indeed, any active involvement on our part may be counterproductive.
Your Honor, the prosecution will concede that Mr. Darwin has not promoted the crime of eugenics, but the prosecution will now pursue the charge of fabrication.
Proceed.
Mr. Darwin, I assume that you are aware fabrication of historical events is a crime in the theocracy of Georgia Line.
Well, no. Having come from the past, I was not aware that fabrication is a crime in this area of the globe at this time.
Georgia Line takes a dim view of variations from biblical truths. And you should know that your hypothesis is at variance with the biblical truth. Can you reconcile your hypotheses with the true biblical narrative?
If you can tell me what the true biblical narrative is, maybe I can reconcile my hypothesis with that narrative. But I am confused about what the biblical narrative actually is. Can you give me specifics? Who created what? When? What constitutes a species? Why are some species genetically more similar to each other than others? Why do bacteria have nearly 70% of the genetic component of humans? What mechanisms in the genetic development of a human turn off the development for the tail, for which the genetic information is available? You know, science stuff.
What is this science? The truth has been revealed to us in the biblical Word of God. Have you no respect for that Word?
I would like to support respect for the Word, but I see no evidence to support that concept.
Then you admit to fabrication in opposition to the Word of God.
I admit only to following the evidence to an honest conclusion. If that means opposing the Word of God, then so be it.
On that blasphemous note, the theocracy of Georgia Line arrests its case against Charles Robert Darwin for the crimes of blasphemy, atavism, moral depravity, aggression, and fabrication.
The jury has the evidence. I remand the case to your deliberation.
And so now, ladies and gentlemen, you are the jury in this trial. And now we shall discuss and vote and see whether Mr. Darwin is guilty of these crimes against the sovereign state of Georgia. First charge of blasphemy. What are your thoughts and opinions on this?
Within this context, within this structure, is he guilty of blasphemy?
Yes.
What is Georgia?
It's a theocratic. It's a theorized. How is that theocratic state created between the Carolinas and Georgia?
Georgia.
We
Well,
that's in southern